Good afternoon. I'm Heather Vosick, Vice President and Dean of Lancaster Theological Seminary and Moravian Theological Seminary. I want to extend a warm welcome to you. We're thrilled that you've joined us for today's discussion of the gift of Black students to graduate theological education. Today's event is sponsored by the Right Reverend Nathan D. Baxter Fund for African American Studies at Lancaster Theological Seminary. You will hear both about and from Bishop Baxter shortly. For now, I'll note that for decades, Bishop Baxter's work and witness have contributed to the seminary's mission to educate and nurture leaders to join in God's redemptive and liberating work so that all creation may flourish. Today's conversation will make clear some of the ways Bishop Baxter has advocated and shepherded and led in pursuit of that mission. Lancaster Theological Seminary is firmly committed to participation in God's redemptive and liberating work. And I am deeply grateful for the faculty, staff, alumni, and students who embody and who celebrate the diversity that makes this both possible and full of joy. We're very fortunate today to have two fabulous speakers and conversation partners in Dr. Baxter and the Very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. We're also privileged that today's conversation will be moderated by Lancaster faculty member, the Reverend Dr. Catherine E. Williams, who is the Assistant Professor of Preaching and Worship and Director of Chapel Worship at the seminary. I'll hand things over now to the Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace, Associate Dean of Lancaster Theological Seminary and Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, who offers our opening prayer.
Let us pray. God of our ancestors and generations yet born, we come giving you thanks and adoration for your goodness, grace, and the gift of this day. We don't take it for granted, O God, for this day was not promised to us. We know that some who were here yesterday aren't here today, and we are ever so grateful that the sheets that covered us were not our winding board sheets, and the beds we slept on were not our cooling boards. So God, we give you praise and thanks. May this evening's conversation, guided by your spirit, O God, be an engaging, thought-provoking, stimulating, and maybe even at times an uncomfortable one on the gift of Black students to graduate theological education. We do not come this evening to talk about your sun-kissed children as an apologetic or to check a box about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but about the full cultural, spiritual, religious, and embodied contributions of U.S. Black, North American, Caribbean, and African students that is a gift to our seminaries, divinity schools, and theological schools in the US and Canada. Bless everyone within the hearing of my voice to receive the words of Bishop Baxter and the Very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who have spent decades in the struggle as both students and leaders to make known the voices and the dreams of and the gifts of Black students to graduate theological education. May we be changed in our thoughts and our ways by their conversations when we leave here. And we'll be ever so careful to give you, God, all the glory and honor. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. I now turn it over to Dr. Catherine Williams.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar, The Gift of Black Students to Graduate Theological Education. Thanks to Dean Vasick for her warm welcome and to Associate Dean Lovelace for her heartfelt prayer that had some Black idioms in there about our cooling board and our winding sheets. That did not escape us. We are in for a treat tonight, but just before this exciting conversation begins, I need to let you know of a few housekeeping details. As you already figured out, all cameras and microphones have been turned off except for the hosts and the panelists. Up next will be a conversation between Dean Douglas and Bishop Baxter. Bishop Baxter has a relationship with Lancaster Theological Seminary and the Episcopal Church that is stellar in service and tenure. His stunning bio is available on our seminary website, and that is not even the half of it. Once you get past his self-deference and his humor, you'll find a world-renowned practitioner and scholar of the church. Students leave his classes deeply transformed in their understanding of social justice and public theology. The Very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas serves as the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology at Union. She also has a stellar reputation as a scholar and clerical practitioner, and her full bio is also available at the click of a link on our website. It will take all the hour we have to talk about the two scholars here this evening. What I will add, though, is a personal memory of attending a webinar with Dean Douglas and President Serene Jones as they spoke frankly, sister to sister, about leadership at the intersection of race and gender. I was struck not only by the remarkable friendship between these two women, but by Dean Douglas's obvious love of lightheartedness and laughter. And between her and the bishop, I may have to tone things down a little tonight. Their conversation will run for about 40 minutes, and following this, they will field a few of your questions. Following the Q&A, our panelists will then offer parting words as we close the webinar around 5. Once the meeting ends, a short survey will pop up requesting your valuable feedback. Please take a moment to let us know how the evening went. You may use the chat feature to register your reactions to the speaker's comments. You know how Black folks do. But if you enter any questions for them to answer in the chat, those are likely to get lost. So for your questions, please use the Q&A box only. And in the Q&A box, if someone has asked a question that you would also like to hear the answer to, click on the thumbs up icon. The more of those thumbs up icons that are clicked, the more the question stays at the top of the list and the more likely it will be to get answered. We also ask that you refrain from using the chat for sidebar conversations addressed to everyone. So thanks for your attention to those housekeeping details. And now it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to turn the webinar over to our world-class panelists for tonight's discussion on the gift of Black students to graduate theological education. Dean Douglas, Bishop Baxter, welcome.
Thank you, Professor Williams. Thank you very much. And I want to thank our Vice President and Dean, Dean Heather, for that warm welcome, and also for our Dean Vanessa Lovelace, who has given this fund a whole different focus, which is really exciting to see it come alive in a very different way. I am truly honored that I can have one more conversation with my dear friend, the Dean Kelly. You know, there's some things about her that you may not know, and I'm going to use these things as a way to begin the conversation. The gift of Black students to graduate theological education. Dean Kelly is the first Black woman or man to be presidential dean of an Episcopal seminary. In the Episcopal Church, the dean is referred to as, the president is referred to as the dean. And so she has both executive responsibility and then delegates the academic as someone who works closely with her as she shapes that. Secondly, she is the first woman or man of African descent to be the canon theologian of Washington National Cathedral. And so we have someone who is, in many ways, embodies what we're talking about of the importance of being a graduate student. She studied with Jim Cone, as many of you know, as well as someone who leads both ecumenical graduate school theological discourse, as well as for the Episcopal Church. So one note in this is that in 2020, Christianity Today identified her as one of the 25 most important influencers of theology, Black theology, in the history, going back to Lemuel Haynes in the Revolutionary War. And so I'm just so proud of you. I could spend this whole 40 minutes saying how proud I am of you, but also I think you embody it. So could you begin us in this conversation by saying a little bit about your journey in terms of how you found theological education and what you felt your presence contributed, as well as having Black faculty as your teachers and mentors, how that influenced you. So if you could just say a little beginning word about that.
Yeah, before I do that, I want to join you in thanking Dr. Williams and Dr. Lovelace and Dr. Vasic for having this conversation and inviting me to be a part of this conversation with not simply my dear friend, but one who has been a mentor for me and on whose shoulders I truly, truly stand. And as Zornell Hurston would say, you know, who has thrown up a highway in the middle of the wilderness for those of us who are blessed with ebony grace to even have the opportunity to do the things that we have been privileged to be able to do. And so I just have to first thank Bishop Nathan Baxter for being my friend and my mentor, and being the person who always gives the straight talk. And I mean it, because I know that I can always call on you, and that's important. And we'll get to that in this whole thing of mentoring and someone letting you know that the impossible possibility is possible. So let me begin here. When you said, let me tell you things that you don't know about her, I wanted to say, as the old folks say in the Black church, watch out now, don't say too much.
So don't tell it all.
Don't tell it all. I was a little bit nervous, but let me answer the question here with my time at Denison and how I got to theological education. And this will speak right to the subject of the importance. First of all, if we're gonna have Black students, in order for that to happen, we have to have some Black mentors, Black professors, and the importance of that. I'll speak about that from my vantage point, and I know this conversation will open it up and we'll talk about the importance of it for those of us who are not blessed with ebony grace. I went to Denison University in Granville, Ohio, small 2,000 or so plus students, liberal arts college, elite liberal arts college. When I went there I graduated from there in 79. So when I was there in the 70s, there were very few persons who looked like myself on that campus, students or otherwise. And in fact, while there were a couple of Black professors here at Denison when I first arrived, there were a whole group sort of came in by my junior year, and what a difference that made for me. It would be the first time that I would really study and take a course in Black literature and really be introduced formally to some of the thinkers that I was reading informally, but to more that I had never heard of before. But that's another topic that perhaps we'll get into. But while I was at Denison, born and raised Episcopalian, and loved the church. But you know, when you're in college, and this again becomes very important, that's when you are really discovering your voice, your passions, and really beginning to think about, in a serious way, who am I? Who am I? How do I fit into this world? What does all of this mean? And trying to pull together these aspects of who you were discovering yourself to be, your identity. And I was always very much committed to the Christian church and a good Episcopalian and all of that. But I got to this point Because at Denison, all of the trials and tribulations of the world of trying to be Black and navigate yourself through this country were there on Denison sits on a hill, on that hill. And I said to myself, what does Christianity got to do with this? And I was more than ready to give up my Christianity because I wasn't gonna compromise or renege on my Blackness. And it was at that time that who was then Dean of Chapel, who I'm still very good friends with, and still teaches at Denison, David Woodyard, handed me the book, Black Theology of Liberation by James Cone. To make a long story short, I took that book home. For some reason, I went home for the weekend, and I read that book twice over that weekend because I said, okay, something's either wrong with the book or something's wrong with the white man who gave it to me. Because you know what James Cone was saying in that book, right? Whiteness is of the Antichrist. So this white man gave me this book. No, something's wrong. But that book spoke deeply to the faith of my grandparents. It reconnected me to that faith. And it spoke deeply to my own sort of aspirations and faith claims and beliefs, but had no way of bringing together, and spoke deeply to the dissonance that I found in the white church. So I went to Union. I'd never heard of theology until that book. And I certainly didn't know what a seminary was all about. And Dean Baxter, we're Episcopalians. And so we don't sit around on Friday nights singing hymns. And gospel music, I said, Lord, I'm going to the seminary. These people are going to be sitting around singing hymns and gospel music and all that on Friday night. So I didn't know if I wanted to come to that, but I ended up here and studying with Dr. Cone. And that's what brought me into theology. I didn't expect that I would learn to love it and that I would end up developing a love and a passion for theology. That happened because Dr. Cone was able, as Black theology was, to show that my story mattered to God, that my story was God's story, and that God's story was my story, and began to show a different gaze and view that I didn't have to know what they were. I did have to know it because I'm a theologian, but that the Nicene story ain't the only story, and that just because my grandmother didn't know anything about homoousia and homoousia, and I didn't either, didn't mean that we weren't Christian. And in fact, it probably meant we were more Christian. But so I studied with him, and I'll end here. What became important, and of course I stayed to do my doctoral work with Dr. Cone. And what was very important about that was this, that it allowed me to do my dissertation and my doctoral work on things that mattered to me, that was about me, my history, my faith, woman. But for Dr. Cone, he gave the platform for Black women to find their voice. And so that became so very important. And so what I see continually as my role, as you did for me and others in the church, as he did with, someone said at Dr. Cone's funeral, I think it was now Senator Raphael Warnock, he said that if you're Black and in theology, you either know somebody, you either studied with Dr. Cone or you studied with somebody who studied with Dr. Cone. It's not about 6 degrees of separation. And what it does is it provides the space for people that have been on the underside, the subjugated knowledges of our academy, to come to the center. And that matters for those of us who have been subjugated, and it matters for those who have come through the gaze, right? This sort of white gaze of normativity, to begin to open that up and to change the gaze.
Dean, all of that is so powerful because it's our journeys as we begin to look collectively that reflect this very small community, which is theological education. I mean, this is a small discipline in many ways in terms of numbers. And when you talked about being able to have not only mentors, but teachers, the first time I had any Black academic teacher was in clinical pastoral education, which is odd because there's so few Blacks in that field. But when I was a seminarian at Lancaster, there was only one other student who was of African descent there at the time. And I've often thought that history, particularly church history, but history is, including the Bible, is are accepted narratives about where we have been. And theology is the way in which accepted narratives are critically interpreted, particularly with regard to the life of the church. Praxis, which is where my heart is that we practice based on history and theology as a way of talking about and resourcing our response to contemporary events and experiences. Now, the problem there is that if there is a narrative, a critical narrative that is absent, how can we have an effective understanding of history, an effective approach to theology? And I think of theology as a quiver with arrows in it. And so when I came, there were no Black faculty. And I was excited, I was eager, and all of the things. But the faculty allowed me, I like to say, like Shirley Chisholm said, if they won't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Well, so I brought a folding chair. And with the support of some of the faculty, thank God they understood the need. I was able to bring people like Jim Cone, people like Jim Forbes, Benny Goodwin, a number of people, Matalata Chubaku, South African activists, to the campus. It was really to feed me, but I began to see how it influenced the faculty and how it influenced the students. Now, they were open to that. It was not a force-fed kind of thing, but they were open to it. One final thing is, I grew up in the Church of God in Christ. So I became an Episcopalian in my 20s. So it was also interesting for me, because at the time I was Church of God in Christ, for them to experience what it was like to worship in a Black church. And interestingly, some of the students went with me and some of the faculty to churches to experience the Black worship experience. Now, I say all of that to say that there has to be a way in which a community is open and willing to receive other narratives, other ways of thinking theologically about history, other ways of knowing history, because there are other stories and other narratives. And that if we are truly a liberal discipline, then we recognize we need more than just the accepted narratives, the accepted ways of interpreting those narratives. So given all of that, what do you say is missing when we do not bring persons into the faculties and the teaching bodies, both particularly tenure, regular faculty, but also adjuncts? When we do not bring them into the core life of a seminary, and when we do not allow the students who come, who are not an empty tablet, they come with experiences, with views about faith and the world. how do we create a way in which seminaries, schools of divinity, are open to doing the work of receiving those gifts?
Yeah, wow, you've asked a lot. But see, I was going to say amen to something else. I wasn't cutting you off. I was going to say an amen. And I know you let that go because you said she's a good Episcopalian. She ain't going to say amen. But and that was to this something that you said and implied here. First of all, is that we have to recognize that bringing having a diverse community, and I hate this word diversity, you know, because that becomes a way of not really talking about Black people and people of color, but creating a community that is more reflective of God's creation, and bringing into a community Black students and other students of color, and Black professors and other professors of color. You aren't doing it just for me, for Black people. What white people have to understand is that this is about their education. I often would say to, when I taught at Goucher College for 17 years, and it's a small white liberal arts school as well. And I would say to the Black students, as I thought about myself going through Denison, you know what, if I make it through this gauntlet here, that I am going to be better educated. And I would tell it to my Black students. You will be better educated than any white student that comes through this school, because you are going to have to learn. We always know more about them than they know about us. You are going to have to learn to navigate a world from a vantage point that is not yours. You are going to have to learn about people that are not you. And you're going to have to figure out how to navigate that. You're going to learn histories and stories that aren't yours, and you're going to figure out how to navigate that. They don't got to do that. And what they don't realize is that that privilege is a penalty. And so first, when we talk about this educationally, you aren't doing this for me. You know, that's sort of like the word that when people always say, those that are not blessed with heavenly grace, they always say, oh, we want to be your ally. No. I want to be your ally because this is your problem, not mine. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing that we have to say and that we have to recognize as educational institutions in general, and it is that what we have not talked about in this country is we talk about the legacy of white supremacy, and we talk about that in terms of systems and structures and institutions. What we don't talk about is the epistemological legacy. And that is a legacy that has legitimized a particular gaze for understanding what is truth, understanding what is knowledge, has defined what knowledge is. And so we have to understand that what we typically encounter, well, not typically, what we encounter in terms of our educational institutions is this epistemological legacy of white supremacy that has made normative a white way of knowing and a white way of engaging the world, engaging experience, engaging history, of naming knowledge, of naming truth. And so that other knowledges have become subjugated, if you will. Now, who does that cheat? That cheats everybody, right? Because we aren't learning our own stories, but it cheats all of us. And if we expect the next generation to be better than this generation, then we got to change the gaze. And then we've got to critique and do something about this. We've got to recognize this epistemological privilege of whiteness. And that's what we encounter in our schools. Now, seminaries have a special, see, sorry, you got me started on this. I love it.
Go. Go, girl.
Seminaries have a special responsibility, because we know that the Latin root for the word seminary is seedbed. And what are we a seedbed for? We are supposed to be a seed bed for God's more just future, right? Faith communities are not to be accountable to the way things are. We're supposed to be accountable to the way we claim they're going to be, right? To God's just future. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that if your whole vision for what that future could look like has been compromised by white epistemological privilege and a white gaze? You can't do that. And so you have to find ways to open up and challenge the gaze, right? And so one of the ways to do that is, of course, what we teach and who we encounter, right? These two things have to happen simultaneously. You know, when you can look at another person, Howard Thurman said that the most fertile soil for racism is the soil of segregation, right? And when people are separate from one another, because you can't look and say, now, you know what, that person over there is a human being and they like the same things I like. Or they, you know, they have a body that gets hurt too. I mean, you know, and there's people think that Black people don't get hurt, but they have a body that gets hurt. They have dreams like we have dreams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's about proximity with people who are different from yourself, engaging different experiences. And it's about studying that so that we say that this isn't the extra history, this is our history, right? The final thing I'll say about that theologically is, you know what, to do anything less is blasphemous. It is a betrayal of God and God's creation. If our task as theologians is as much as possible to have greater and greater understanding of the God who has created us, then the way in which we do that is through God's very creation, right? And so in as much as we close off any story that is a part of God's created creation, then we are closing off an aspect, and I mean this, of who God is.
Yes.
And so, I'll stop there, and so it really is about changing the gaze, the narrative, and bringing those subjugated knowledges and experiences to the center. And if we don't do that, then we are not going to get any further along this road to justice.
Wow. You know, I mentioned a little bit earlier about theological education, and particularly formal graduate theological studies. It's a small community, the Association of Theological Schools. But it's getting smaller.
Yeah.
Because more and more we are finding in terms of recruiting students who find other ways to fulfill their concerns about service and justice, ways in which they can shape society by direct action or social action or political action. Yet at the same time, God's still in the calling business. And so that's one piece. But another piece related to this is that the more that we look at the change in theological education, white Protestantism, as we have understood it, is also becoming less effective in addressing the world around them. And I'm not just talking about people who are minorities or people of color, but the folks in their pews, at least the people who are left in the pews, how they might address that. Now, having said that, I think the future of theological education is going and is demanding that we have more narratives, first of all, about history. And we need more ways of talking about how we understand the purpose of God. Jim Forbes talked about the Black theology. The first, of course, is about the liberation of Black people, but the second is the ontological liberation of white people and the church, as you referred. And he's very clear about the fact that if we take it out of the context of simply skin color, then we ought to be able to see about how God suffers for that which God believes and has called us into being. So the whole matter of the community of theological education, if you do not have students with backgrounds in the African-American experience, in the LGBTQ plus experience, in the international student experience, those that come from bringing them together, because they already come to us with disciplines. In Lancaster, we've got people with business backgrounds, law backgrounds, education. I had a student at a PhD in physics. I was like, what am I going to say to this guy? But he was there for a purpose. So I believe that theological education needs to have the voice, the story, the passion, the spirituality of Black students from the African diaspora. And I think it is critical not just to have them at the table. I often say liberal hermeneutic says, let's get everybody at the table, let's look good. And that's okay. I mean, there was a time we didn't even get that. But it is also about liberation hermeneutic, that I invite you into this community because I know your experience is going to change me. It's going to change the way we interpret. It's going to change the way we worship. It's going to change the way that we laugh. It's going to enrich the way that we go out to serve. So I often say that the best theological education, or the best educational context, is where some learn by teaching and some teach by learning.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, is that if you have Black students, they're going to bring to bear the story of what it's like to live, and not just live in the ghetto. I'm talking about Black people who live middle-class lives, and what they are struggling with, what they're dealing with, and how they have survived. That this, if we listen as faculty, if we listen as fellow students and welcome that narrative, even as it's emerging with a kind of equal respect, it can do something to help save not only theological education, because it'll give it a relevance, but it will empower students who are not of color to be more effective as they go out into the world that they will serve. So I just can't imagine that we would have theological education going forward in a way that is effective and faithful to the vision and passion of God without having diversity, which includes Ebony Grace. That's Courtwright. We're quoting
Courtwright Davis. That's Courtwright Davis's term.
Someone who's been a great mentor to us both, and he talks about Ebony Grace, but that's another thing. So having said that, could you say a word about, a little bit more about what is there that is essential about not only encouraging and recruiting students of African descent, and especially African Americans, but of African descent, and understanding that we are bringing them here not to learn alone, but to teach also?
Yeah.
Dean Douglas, as you get ready to answer that, I should just give you a 5-minute warning. We do have a lineup of questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
So thank you.
So I'll just take 2 minutes. First of all, because, one of the things I kept thinking, Bishop Baxter, was, good thing that I was born in the generation that I was born in, because if I was coming through the same time you were, I don't know how you did it. Because I think, I would have to hurt somebody, but because you really did throw up a highway in the middle of a wilderness, as did those others who've gone before us. And that's what keeps me doing what I do, that there were people who never dreamt of the opportunities that we had and fought for these opportunities anyway. Yeah. But I love to reverse this conversation one day and interview you about that story. And I mean it. Because there's much to learn, and that leads me, there's much for all of us to learn. in those stories of people who resisted giving into the world the way it was, those witnesses that believed in spite of it all, that it could be different. And the fact that Black people are even engaged and have these degrees and are going to college and engaged in higher education is a testament to a people and their story. And it's a testament of resistance to the stubbornness of white supremacy and the institutionalization and institutional stubbornness of it. You know, we can talk about white supremacy in terms of systemic and structural, economically, politically, et cetera. But it stands its ground through discourse. And it gets people to believe that the way things are is the way they're supposed to be, and that the way things are is the right way. And only and this discourse is disseminated through social institutions, the church, the family, and educational institutions. It is no accident that our educational institutions have been really privileged institutions, right? You know, it's also no accident that the moment more people of color began to take part and poor people in higher education, it gets more and more expensive because it wasn't meant for everybody. It was meant for the elite. It was meant for the white elite. And so because what you're doing in these institutions, if you don't change, is what you're doing is you are training people not to transform the world, but to protect the status quo. Theological institutions are not supposed to protect the status quo. Theological institutions are to be accountable to God's promise for a more just future and to transform. So now how do we begin to nurture and foster the kind of students that we're going to send out that will transform? First, we have to provide them with transformative and transforming education, right? And let's just start with the baby. You know, you don't got to like me. You ain't got to like nobody Black, and you don't have to like any people of color. But guess what? The world really isn't white. And so you have to learn how to engage with people who are different from yourself. And if along the way you learn something, good for you. But I think that's our moral responsibility. That's our moral obligation. This isn't, whether you like it or not, it isn't about, you know, people have made this big to do about critical race theory. They don't even know what it is. But as theologians, as faith leaders, as theological institutions, we need to be the loudest voices out there in support of critical race theory, because what critical race theory is doing is opening us up to another way of seeing history, of seeing the world, of reading experience. And guess what, Dean Baxter? I call you Dean Baxter, look at you, the first Black dean of the cathedral, Washington National Cathedral. When we negate that story, those stories, guess who else's story we're negating? We have a God that entered into history. We are negating the story of God. We're supposed to be Christians. Let's act like it, because our Christian God is a God that is incarnate, that came into history. And so that means we have to open ourselves to the history that is God. And so in as much as theological institutions only want to talk about one particular dominant history through a white gaze, then you have indeed cut yourself off from even understanding the God that has entered into history. So we have a moral mandate. We have a mandate of faith. The last thing I'll say is, yes, that as you encounter people who are different from yourselves, you can learn. But Black people don't come to campus to be objectified. Black people don't come to campus to teach white people how to not be racist. And I don't like anti-racism. And our job is to move toward racial justice, a more just society, right? And so Black students aren't there to teach you. And so they're there to be students as well. And so you're not to have these I-it relationships with them. Let's treat each other as human beings. I-thou relationships, learn to live in discomfort when you were challenged by
Abraham
other
Lincoln,
people's
yeah.
experiences, right? But these are human beings. These students are students. They're students that get hurt. They're students that are traumatized, and they're students that have paid a whole hell of a lot of money to learn and not to teach you about them. And so we got to keep that in mind. The gift of Black students is the gift of a sacred human being, and you treat them as the sacred gift that they are. And as we can learn from one another, you'll learn from them, but they aren't objects. They aren't essential, as you would say, essential laborers. We've been essential laborers too long. They aren't your essential laborers. They are essential, sacred human beings, and we'll learn from them.
I want to open the doors of the church at this time. And if there's anyone who is ready to come forward and accept Jesus into your heart and be transformed into liberation and justice, I invite you to come forward. Sister Catherine, can you play something on the organ for us?
You can tell that you were UCC before you came to us.
No matter what the denomination or tradition may be, there is something in the power of proclamation that no matter what you're doing, Dean has shown us that sermon comes forward.
Absolutely.
Catherine, we turn to you.
Wow, this was just so enriching and inspiring and energizing. I really do feel energized. And we have approximately 14 minutes left of our appointed time. So here is question number 1. Can you talk about the need for Black PhDs, if you see a need? Relatedly, do you think that Black religious professionals and thinkers are redirected to Doctor of Ministry programs instead because of narratives about whether we Black folks can do PhD work?
Yeah, I'll be real brief and then give it to the dean here. And now I'm calling him the dean because he's the dean of us who are really new in this thing. But so I'll say 2 quick things. Yes, the first answer, yes, there's a need for Black PhDs because we need to do, first, we're interested in many things, but by and large, it's going to be Black PhDs, Black doctors, Black, et cetera, who are going to do the research and the work that brings our stories to the forefront, our scholarship, but also when we talk about Black doctors, et cetera, that do the work that about our health and our well-being, right? And that are going to be interested in that work. And that's why places like Howard, that's also why HBCUs are being attacked, but that's why places like Howard remain the places that where the majority of Black PhDs, et cetera, come through and the work that they do. The other thing that they asked, the second part of that question, yes, there are still, and we know, there are always these places in the academy and disciplines that Black people are closed out from, as are women and others, because if you can protect those fields, then you can protect the narrative and the story. And so for long, when I was at Union, Katie Cannon used to tell this story. They said, and so I'm still in my dear late sister Katie Cannon's story, but it's true. When we were at Union, there weren't any Black people studying in the biblical field because they said there was a narrative that Black people didn't like the Bible. Now, who in the world that I'm trying to get Black people away from so much Bible sometime. But if you open up the Bible, see what happened when it was opened up to women. If you open up these fields of study to people who've been closed out from them, look how it opens it up. And so there is, we have to just own this educational epistemological, this legacy of epistemological, that is a white supremacy, legacy of white supremacy that is epistemological. And now I'll turn it over to the real dean here.
No. I mean, that is right on. In fact, I wanted to mention, Katie Cannon was my wife's mentor. Mm-hmm. And when I was at the Episcopal Divinity School and she was at Harvard grad school, they had a group of women of color who met every week and studied with Katie. And we brought her here to Lancaster a couple of times, but she is a blessed memory, a blessed memory.
And let me just add this, Bishop Baxter, when I came to Union, Katie was a student here. Again, this sort of gift of students. Katie took me, I mean, paved the way and took me in, and many a night of just, you know, where I could have otherwise given up or gone crazy. She had already paved the way.
She really had. She really had. Two quick responses. First of all, I believe that we need more PhDs, partly because of the badge, the union card, and across the disciplines, not just you know, one particular discipline. And also, we need those who can go into places where they can do what you just talked about and nurture, strengthen, and empower both Black students, other students of color, but also challenge the notions that white students have, that either if you are a Black PhD, you probably got on affirmative action, or you really don't have anything to say to me. They need that symbol that causes them to question the intellectual abilities of people of color. But the second thing I would say is that the D-men is still very important. I am very moved by the demons that I see, partly because, for two reasons. One is, I think in a good D-men program, its purpose is to prepare reflective practitioners, persons who have had enough experience that they can bring to a critical academic community that experience and be pushed to shape it in ways that will be resourceful and useful, not only in their ministry, taking it to another level, but become another resource for theological education. And so I think we need both, but I think we need to push for more academics, particularly PhDs. And I want to put it this way. Without that, we will lose a lot of persons who feel called to ministry without the PhD track, who feel called to ministry and to service and to the life of the mind within ethics and theology and history and so on. But they assume that you can only do that by becoming a pastor. And so I think more and more there are people with that call, and we need to nurture that call and help them to understand, you know, you don't have to come here to be a pastor or a preacher. When I say here, to a graduate degree, a PhD or THD, though that's fading. I think that's important, but we need them both. And where we see those who are very disciplined and effective, I think of people like Jim Forbes and Fred Williams, who were D-men students, but they were serious theologically reflective persons. I think of just a quick example, when Dietrich Bonhoeffer came to Union, and he went, was it Abyssinia Baptist Church?
Yeah.
And he got there and he not only heard the preacher, but he also heard preachers that were coming from the Deep South who were dealing with the social justice, the civil rights issues, even at the peril of their lives. And when he experienced that, he realized that he needed to go back home. So I think also when he experienced those things at Union, but also at Abyssinia, that holding those two pieces together, a rigorous D-men program for those who have a calling to practice and want to grow in their ability to practice, and then those who have the call to the academic rigor of teaching and research, If we can hold those two pieces together, Union and Abyssinia, it will change and affect the lives of many people, including as it did for Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. A PhD and a Doctor of Ministry student answering with that question. What else can we ask? I would insert here before I pick up the next question that it's important for Black students to consult with Black academics about this question. Yeah. Which direction should they go? That I would definitely, as a faculty, a Black faculty, encourage the Black students to talk with a Black academic about this question. Question number 2, and I've asked Dean Bassick if she would take this question. I'd love to hear more about Moravian LTS plans to engage and expand the faculty of color, both adjunct and tenure track, so as to better represent the diversity of the student body.
Yes, thanks for this question. I'm going to offer a few thoughts, and then Bishop Baxter, Dean Douglas, if you are willing to chime in, I would welcome your advice to institutions along these lines. Both Lancaster and Moravian Theological Seminary have made explicit commitments on part of the faculty to hire Black faculty, scholars of color, non-white faculty as new hires, tenure track, and adjunct faculty. Proof is in the pudding and will be in the pudding. And so that is, I realize, a hollow answer when it doesn't predict the future. So questions like this to hold the institution accountable are important. Here are some things that I have learned in thinking about this. Some of this is from Willie James Jennings in conversations and trying to think about hiring. But here is where Bishop Baxter, Dean Douglas, I will welcome your additions or corrections. So this is not just about a hire, it's about an institution understanding why a hire is being made. It's about the kind of essential voices, bodies at the table for conversation that we've heard throughout today's conversation. It's about, openness to other narratives in the faculty meeting as well as in the classroom. And so that kind of openness needs to be there. This is a commitment that needs to be infused throughout the institution, from board to faculty to students, with a broad understanding of why that commitment's there. I have often seen student advocacy as a prompt for change in hiring. And so students out there, your voices are important in this. And we've heard some of that importance and the reason students advocate, so that there are faculty and students who understand one another. And then finally, I'll say that I think there's some pitfalls that white institutions should expect they're going to fall into and not presume they can avoid. And it's things like, and again, we've heard much of this today, presuming there's a kind of normative knowledge in any particular field, and we can exclude people because they don't fit the normative knowledge. Someone's going to say something along those lines. You should expect it to know how you're going to deal with it. At institutions' peril, they will underestimate the weight of being a faculty of color in a predominantly white institution, what that means in terms of student support and carrying a voice. I think being aware of the ways that institutions want to shape themselves back to an old norm in ways that are pernicious for the people in them is not to be underestimated. This needs to be about full-time faculty, not just adjunct faculty. So these are some of the things I think that sit behind an institution having a shot of making a commitment here. So, but Bishop Baxter, Dean Douglas, add more here that Lancaster and Moravian and other seminaries should be thinking about.
And very conscious of time, so I'll just be quick.
Please
and
go ahead.
Emphasize something that you said, Dean Bassick, that I wanted to raise, that the weight of this isn't just on the faculty of color that you bring in. And it shouldn't be expected that faculty of color, one, have to teach ethnic Black things, and they shouldn't be the only ones doing that. Mm-hmm. And so the other thing is that in our curriculums, we have to make sure that these aren't electives, that they are central to the curriculum, their requirements. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking, how do you teach a course on American history and you aren't taught, it shouldn't just be a Black history course or a Black religion course that you're going to talk about narratives that are not white narratives. So there may be, the institution probably has to have a real commitment to retooling for some of your professors, and a different look and a relook at the curriculum. There has to be a curricular audit. And so the burden of this shouldn't be, oh, we're going to get some Black professors and now we're going to have this. No, whether you have Black professors or not, these things need to be central to your curriculum, and they need to happen in the spaces where people don't typically think they're going to have, oh, we're going to talk about Black people today. Yes, that's
must be Friday.
Right, must be Friday, because that's because that's the only way in which we're going to begin to help people to begin to change their whole perspective on what knowledge is and what's important to learn, and whether or not Black people or other people of color have anything to offer in terms of our field of knowledge. And so I think that we have to, so the institution has to do that apart from bringing Black people in isn't going to solve the institutional problem. And that's the difference between diversity and real diversity, representation, and real sort of changing the culture of an institution. It means not inviting us to your agenda, to your curriculum. It means that there's been some investment on understanding that there has to be a change inside out, top to bottom, et cetera. Finally, I'll just echo what you said. Black professors and professors of color do a whole lot of unpaid labor. And so I've been there, done that, doing that. And so for the institution to recognize the unpaid labor of these professors of color, and this becomes important not only to their well-being and their research, but to their tenure. Does this unpaid labor get counted for tenure? And so this is what I'm talking about. And when you bring in these professors of color, they're doing unpaid labor, and it's not getting counted toward their tenure, but they're being penalized for it, because it's like, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Well, because I was doing this. And so I think there has to be a institutional audit on what's going on.
I would offer an amen to everything that Dean Douglas has said. And I would offer two very quick further suggestions. The one is that the absence of diversity on faculties, and particularly people of color, has been a matter of passive neglect. I think one of the ways of correcting that is being strategic and public, so that you're held to your publics, so that you're held accountable. So if you've got a good strategic plan, this is what we are hoping to accomplish to strengthen who we are in our teaching community. And here are the ways strategically that we're going to fundraise, we're going to allocate resources to make that happen. Then you're accountable. But just simply to sit around in faculty meeting or board meeting and say, okay, we can go out there and see if we can find a Black professor of I don't know what, basket weaving or whatever. I think institutionally, it's got to be a strategic institutional commitment to which one will be held accountable. The second thing, and this is piggybacking on something that you said, Dean Douglas, when I was dean at Lancaster Seminary, one of the things I changed was that service to the church was a critical part of evaluation, both for promotion and for tenure. Had quite a battle, but it got in there. If indeed we are in service of the church, then there needs to be something that you are doing that represents not just the academy, but the church. And I think that's still a part. I don't know if it is or not, but it was for many decades. The other part of that is that when there are sabbatical proposals, asking the question, I'm just picking on him because he's my buddy. Greg Carey, what is there in New Testament that you might be considering that has to do with a different hermeneutic? Maybe in Black studies, studying with a Black biblical scholar, or going and doing some research to bring that forward. Now that's dangerous because you feel like if you come back with that, then people are going to jump all over you and say, oh, that's not authentic or whatever. But just like the call that a person have some evidence of service to the church, should we not ask that some of that sabbatical time, the project, the research, be focused, in this case, on something related to the theological experience and narrative and hermeneutic of people of color, so that it's not just the burden of Vanessa or of Catherine or of some adjuncts, that this is a shared reality that faculty that we respect and honor are also learning so that they can come back and be effective, not only intellectually, but it changes our soul when we go outside our comfort zone.
Wow. This has been just an ultimately rich, rich hour. And I saw someone in the chat said it should really have been 2 hours. It's true. This is a Black conversation. It just really takes more time. But thank you. Thank you so much, Dean Douglas. Thank you so much, Bishop Baxter. Thank you so deeply, Dean Vasick and Dean Lovelace, for your input into this evening, this hour of power, I'd like to call it. And the chat, there were so many other questions in the Q&A that would have been merited your wisdom and your knowledge, but maybe you can take a look at those and just see what the interest of tonight's audience was. But thank you so very much. And to all of you, to the media services at Moravian University, you were outstanding in your work preparing and executing this webinar. Thank you so much for everyone who was involved. Have a wonderful evening and blessings be multiplied to you.
Love you, Dean Douglas.
Love you. Let's connect.
Okay, let's do.
Yeah, thank you for this.